Our featured speaker tonight, Professor Katherine Rodier, is our first annual Sarah Denman Faces of Appalachia Fellow. And we are very excited about that and eager to hear her presentation tonight about the life and works of writer and social activist Bessie Woodson Yancey. We also have 3 other distinguished Marshall University faculty who are going to be responding to Dr. Rodier's presentation. We have Dolores Johnson from the English department, next to her Bernice Morris from the School of Journalism, and Greta Renzenbrink, who teaches women's history here at Marshall. At this time, Sarah Denman, who has been a faithful and hardworking supporter of the Faces of Appalachia project since it began, is going to give us a few words of greetings. After that, we will move directly to the featured presentation and then to the 3 respondents without further introductions. We will take your questions and comments at the very end. Thank you.
This is certainly an honor to be here, and more than that, it is a special honor to have this symposium to carry my name, because this is something that is very near and dear to my heart, and that's the whole Appalachian studies, the culture, the grant, the Faces of Appalachia. We're so privileged to live in a state, the only state, that is 100% in the Appalachian region. And I'm especially honored tonight that the first speaker would be Dr. Katherine Rodier. I mean, that is just very special. I think that we're all going to be in for such a treat. And how fitting to have someone who has devoted so much of their time and their efforts of their life to this study and to making sure that generations to come will know about Appalachian studies. You know, I think that one of the finest poets who ever lived was a shepherd named David, who later became a king of Israel. But in one of his psalms, Psalm 121, it begins by saying, "I will lift up my eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my strength." Appalachians know all about strength from the hills. They know about strength from the mountains, from the valleys, from the rivers, and from the hills. We know how that has molded our lives, how it has formed our thoughts and our feelings, our culture, our literature, our history. And we have such an obligation to make sure that every generation continues to know what the Appalachian studies have to teach and what we have to be the guiding force in their life. That is a challenge that we all have. We need to remember where we came from, what we learned, and to make sure that future generations will always know what it means to be an Appalachian and what Appalachian studies has to mold the future of this world. It is the hills that gave us our strength. And tonight we are privileged to hear someone talk about an individual, and I'm sure that strength will be one of the characteristics of this person. So with no further ado, Dr. Rodier.
I hope that stays there. Thank you. Thank you, Sarah and Linda and those others involved with Faces of Appalachia, past and present. I think Linda mentioned most of you. Everyone that we forgot, thank you too. Thanks also to Ancella and Nelson Bickley, to tonight's respondents, and especially to Laura Tussey and Diane Wellman for helping with the original research for this project. I'd like to start by taking you back, not that I was there, but by taking you back to Sunday, August 27th, 1939, when the Huntington Herald Advertiser, your streamlined newspaper, ran its 50th anniversary issue. The headline read, "Peace Outlook Darkens. Hitler Cancels Party Congress at Nuremberg," even as the front page celebrated another 50 years of progress. This issue expressed both a forward look and a reflection of Huntington's past, including a series of I Remember columns, for which a Mrs. Marrow won the first prize. On that day, the Betty Gay shop was 21 years old. You only needed to put $7.50 down for your Westinghouse refrigerator, and The Wizard of Oz played at the Keith Albee Theater. And for one night only, September 5th, Ella Fitzgerald and the famous Chick Webb Band would perform at the Vanity Fair from 9:30 until 2 o'clock. Table reservations in advance were 75 cents. But even as Huntington celebrated its growth, its Sunday paper documented the city's discrimination. For the Fitzgerald show, the ad concluded, "Entire balcony reserved for white spectators." And the supplement that reproduced the Herald Advertiser's inaugural issue from 1889 matter-of-factly reported the lynching that year of a black man named Turner and outbreaks of mob violence by Negro miners near the New River, a reminder of the state's racist legacy. In the midst of these contrasts, columnist Dallas Higbee contributed an article, "Negro Matron is Publishing Poetry," which begins, "A Negro matron at the county courthouse, the daughter of slave parents, is an accomplished poet." The poet was Bessie Woodson Yancey, whose writing, both poetry and prose, as I came to learn, in many ways reflected the social and cultural crossings that this special issue of the Herald Advertiser documents. When I first moved to Huntington in 1995, and my friend Kathy Seelinger pointed out the statue of educator and African-American historian Carter G. Woodson on Hal Greer Boulevard, I confessed that I had no idea that he had any personal connections to this area, let alone a younger sister who was herself a writer. I had always associated him and his work with Washington, D.C., where I had grown up. Thankfully, my education began immediately. One day I got a phone call from another friend, Kate Smith, in Connecticut, who had begun work for her dissertation on some African-American writers. She reported excitedly, "And one of them is from Huntington." And so began my introduction to my subject tonight. Currently, if Yancey's name sparks recognition beyond her hometown of Huntington, it may be largely because of Carter G. Woodson. Their family had migrated from rural Virginia to the turn-of-the-century river and rail boomtown, Huntington, when Woodson was a youth. Yet Yancey was herself a writer of conviction, both as a poet in the late 1930s and as a frequent contributor to the Huntington Herald Advertiser just after World War II, through more than a decade of editorial-style letters on global, national, regional, and local topics. Her contributions to the weekly column The Reader Speaks were so frequent that she began to publish there under pseudonyms like Bronze and Tan Yank. With its remarkable trajectory from earnest and nostalgic poetry, dialect poems, anthems, songs and sketches, didactic lyrics, and others, to a politicized prose voice, Yancey's writing deserves further recognition and study. As an African-American writer from a Southern family relocated in 20th century Appalachia, Yancey not only composed across genres but across regions, with her work growing to document a multifaceted critique of social developments across the United States and the world. And as a woman of her race in this regional crossroads, seeking at this time a public literary voice, Bessie Woodson Yancey implicitly crossed cultural borders every time she wrote, a complexity that my study traces. With Catherine Capshaw Smith of the University of Connecticut, my aforementioned friend Kate, I am in the process of recovering and collecting Yancey's newspaper commentary from 1946 to 1958 for a critical edition to be published along with her reissued poetry collection, Echoes from the Hills, and other texts. Yancey's outspoken editorializing in over 100 printed letters to the editor is both historically revealing and inspiring in its clear-sighted yet emotionally powerful arguments. Frequently urging an empowered and empowering vision of Black history, Yancey's pithy letters to the Reader Speaks also denote more local concerns like Huntington's civic pride and productivity. Yet, in her letter entitled The Myth of Race, she decries American injustice not only by using a collective personal pronoun, but by supplying a global context. Quote, "Foreign countries cannot understand why we permit our nationals to be insulted, mobbed, and lynched. Not even Nazi Germany did that. In Russia, one person may not refer to another's race, color, or origin in a derogatory manner under penalty of fine and imprisonment," unquote. Other letter topics range from Negro music to commentary on George Washington Carver, Ralph Bunchy, John Brown's legacy, lynching, Southern politicians, and Jim Crow laws. For her efforts, Yancey might suffer harassment, as documented by another contributor to the newspaper's letter columns. Nonetheless, her will to chronicle the truths she saw, and from a regional vantage, which some critics even now might assume by virtue of locale is necessarily remote or benighted, appeared steadfast, rich, and provocative, albeit based in a then segregated city and nation. With a focus on the shifting regional issues that Yancey evokes in her poetry and newspaper letters, this study positions her perspectives as relevant to a continually evolving history of racial community, protest, and affirmation in this crossroads region and beyond. Yancey's border-blurring aesthetic provides a crucial context for examining her political writings. On the one hand, her 1939 collection of poetry supplies an inclusive approach to audience voice and subject matter, we'll call that cross-writing, that can be seen as groundbreaking. Although Echoes does not assert itself as a children's text, Smith points out that Carter G. Woodson, an eventual authority over the selections that appeared in the volume, advertised his sister's work in the Negro History Bulletin, which Smith identifies as primarily a children's magazine. As Smith notes, when Yancey includes schoolbook poems, verses in conventional English and regular meter, they signify on classroom knowledge. As I argue in a recent Mellis article, Multi-Ethnic Literature of the United States is the journal title, her verse, "If You Live in West Virginia," recasts sentiments found also in the West Virginia State Song in order to emphasize Black freedom and agency. Other poems explicitly evoke the challenges of life in the mines and on the rails, familiar to her personally from the labors of family members. Clearly, Yancey knows that a child reader may converse in the language of the classroom, but also that the child may think beyond pedagogical confines and offer a Black regional perspective on conventional schoolhouse knowledge and forms. This context becomes particularly compelling when considering Yancey's work for her newspaper audiences. First, because of the rise in literacy rates in the Depression-era South, young people, including African Americans, were just as likely, if not more likely, as were adults to read Yancey's columns, those virtually weekly Sunday letters. We see an awareness of this implicit audience of younger readers in several places in her political writings. In these, she sometimes interacts directly with concerns that her brother more famously expounded. Woodson, who founded Negro History Week in 1926, became known as the schoolmaster to his race. For example, in her editorial, Knowledge Needed, which she published under the pseudonym Bronze, Yancey notes, quote, "In order to correctly analyze present events, one must first have some knowledge of what has gone before. The history of the Negro goes further back than the slave ships and cotton plantations. Our school curricula reveals little or nothing of the Negro's past. In justice to all youth, they should be shown the true picture of what each race has contributed to world progress. Then there wouldn't be so much to unlearn." Quote. Echoing Woodson's ideas in the 1933 Miseducation of the Negro, Yancey appreciates the need for young people to embrace the study of Black history and also to apply that history to contemporary socio-political analysis. In places, her columns more explicitly participate in her brother's avowed mission, calling for celebrations of Negro History Week and directing her audience to the work of Black critics and historians like W.E.B. Du Bois, Kelly Miller, and Alain Locke. Yancey's crucial role as intermediary comes into relief at those junctures in her writing. Although geographically distant, if not estranged, from the seats of influence in black culture like Harlem and her brother's adopted home, Washington, D.C., Yancey imagined herself both in dialogue with more public intellectuals and as a popularizer of their ideas. As the articulate sister of Black America's preeminent historian, Yancey enjoyed literal distance notwithstanding a certain proximity to the currents of Black intellectual life. As a Black Appalachian committed equally to cross-writing and to galvanizing the Black community, Yancey involved her multiply constituted local audience in political and aesthetic issues that engaged thinkers nationally. Her work calls out to marginalized readers ranging from Black children to Southern women to engage them in the national debate over creating a new Black American identity. Just as Northern and urban intellectuals were reconfiguring racial identity within their own geographic contexts, Yancey challenged her readers, her audience, to reimagine Appalachia and the South as a site, or as sites, of revitalized Black social and cultural production. Strikingly, Yancey's voice in her letters, columns, insists on the relevance of regional experience to national ideological concerns. In an attempt to advance desegregation, Yancey wrote in a letter titled Fair Play, and this is her letter. This beautiful river town, nestling at the intersection of 3 historic states and easily accessible to transportation by rail or stream, has traditions of which it may be proud. In one respect, however, the Jewel City lags behind many smaller towns of the state, that is, in her treatment of all her citizens. In proportion to their numbers, Negroes pay taxes on more real estate here than in any other town of the tri-state area, yet they are shut out of these show houses as though they were lepers. The only available park, Camden, they can rent only on rare occasions and then are not permitted the use of the swimming pool. In towns such as Charleston, the state capital, Parkersburg, Clarksburg, Fairmont, and Wheeling, one section of the main auditoriums of theaters is reserved for the colored. Around the mining camps, all share alike. Come on, Huntington, let's make this a first city not only in beauty and industrial might, but also in fair play to all. She saw her region not apart from the South, and the South not apart from the world. Among her most important contributions to Black civil rights were her repeated castigations of Mississippi politician Theodore Gilmore Bilbo. His dates are 1877 to 1947, and what she calls his ilk. As Yancey proclaims, quote, "Of course, these hate-mongers, these scions of the Bourbon South, do not realize that their aspersions are in reality boomerangs, boosts for those whom they seek to stigmatize. For in the minds of right-thinking people, especially those of foreign countries, such tirades focus attention on the strange fact that men of such abysmal ignorance and imbecility could not have the status of squire in England, yet are permitted to stand before Congress of this great democracy. Why?" As in many other columns, Yancey here argues against Southern marginalization or isolationism by asserting the region's international significance. Within a global context, Southern, including Southern Appalachian representatives, reflect the nation's identity, offering a questionable attitude toward race relations that right-minded Southerners should challenge and that international audiences should criticize. Similarly, Yancey's August 1946 commentary, another peace sign, bronze, on a lynching that took place in Monroe County, Georgia, strategically places Black civil rights and Southern identity at the heart of international concerns. This is Yancey again. The brutal massacre of 4 Negro Americans near Monroe, Georgia, 2 of whom were young women, one a veteran of 5 years' service in Australian and North African campaigns, and 3 of whom were in no way implicated in the alleged stabbing of a young white man who is still alive and in a hospital, has shocked the nation. Across the waters now going on are trials of German war criminals whose guilt is known, who starved and tortured Allied war prisoners in concentration camps until they were forced to eat their own excretions, became cannibals, and turned upon each other. Yet they are being given fair trials. with attorneys being employed to defend them. These poor victims of Southern hate and prejudice were not given the consideration one would show to a dog. America has set herself up as a world leader of democracy. She cannot afford to ignore this stain upon her garments, for the eyes of the world are on her. Throughout such letters, Yancey is intensely concerned to express Black patriotism, often recounting African American contributions to military causes, in part because such gestures place Black men within a visible national and global context that wrested them away from stereotypes of primitivism and provincialism. That one of the Monroe victims was a long-standing veteran of international military experience clearly disturbed Yancey. By invoking the atrocities of the Holocaust and recounting the fair-minded treatment of the worst war criminals, Yancey brings the weight of global battle for democracy to bear on the abuses and oppression associated with the South. In fact, Yancey was right about a national focus on the Monroe lynching. The New York Times offered 43 separate articles on it in 1946, and Harry S. Truman deployed 25 FBI agents and 75 Georgia investigators on the matter. Attention to the event strongly influenced Truman's desegregation of the armed forces in 1948. For a single Black matron whose outspoken editorials and family connections may have resonated among Huntington's citizens of multiple races, the threat of racial violence at this time was anything but abstract. Perhaps not coincidentally, a few months after Yancey's column on the Monroe lynchings, she received at her home a threat apparently from the Ku Klux Klan. As described in a letter in the Herald Advertiser from another Huntington resident, Harry M. Wilson, the, quote, unsigned letter read, "If I were you, I would be wise, stay my, hear the imprint of a hand," was inserted, and not write anything more. Wilson concludes by calling on the town's moral conscience to expel hatred. Quote, Huntingtonians, are you harboring this viper's nest of a Ku Klux Klan in your fair city? Political honor requires that you crush it while there is time, unquote. Although Yancey did not publish again for about a month, the threat by no means silenced her passionate political voice. One of her first letters published after the threat was another fervent exhortation to oust Bilbo. Ever the poet, even after she stopped publishing poems, her only book was the 1939 Echoes from the Hills, Yancey resourcefully took her vibrant voice to this new stage, the pages of her community's newspaper, which was by no means a Black publication. In effect, she single-handedly worked to integrate its pages fearlessly and repeatedly throughout the post-war 1940s into the 50s, charged with the power of biblical rhetoric and common sense. While her written challenges and assertions might often bear a peculiarly local stamp, her vision proved nonetheless universalizing in its scope. While some of her diatribes against race-based economic discrimination and against racially motivated violence might in her writings target locations down there, conveying a sense, too, of a particular Southern setting where such wrongs might be particularly egregious, Yancey's individualized comments take on the quality of utterance, more like the words of a self-appointed spokesperson or even prophet. To close, though, I'd like to go back to Yancey's poems. Certainly, Yancey's poetic renditions are not always original. They modify and signify on lyric impulses found in the work of forerunners as diverse as Anne Bradstreet and James Whitcomb Riley, William Cullen Bryant, and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, as well as Paul Laurence Dunbar, whose influence Smith discusses in depth. Yancey even echoes Emily Dickinson, writing patly with the 20th century consumer's take on Dickinsonian irony. This is for my class. I have a bank account with God, my wealth untaxed and free, no fear of shortage, loss, or fraud throughout eternity. Significantly, Yancey chooses dialect poems to close her collection. As Joan R. Sherman sees it, despite its perpetuation of stereotypes, the literary use of dialect by earlier Black writers had directed both self-preservation and race progress through, quote, making the Black man acceptable to white America, unquote. Populating her writing with both tricksters and pillars of virtue serves Yancey not only to validate such figures and their lives, but to validate those like herself who profit from singing and from hearing their praises sung, and who also stand to sing them again. One hero likely to appeal across generations would be the father that Yancey delineates in The Train Man's Call. After his emancipation from slavery, James Henry Woodson worked laying railroad in central West Virginia from 1870 to 1874, years in that area of the deadly construction of Big Bend Tunnel, where, quote, no one knows how many men or mules died, unquote. This arduous and often horrific enterprise gave life around 1873 to the folk legend of John Henry, another musical president that Yancey probably knew. In The Trainman's Call, Yancey constructs a more understated but no less compelling hero. Her poem juxtaposes a tribute to her father's occupation with her reading of nature, concurrently but subtly implying a collective past that included slavery and other brutal forms of work. In The Trainman's Call, the railman's simple song both affirms and signifies the bond between father and family. The whippoorwill call also evokes similar coded communication that once transpired between slaves by the grapevine telegraph, even as it literally echoes and transforms Yancey's references in other poems to the violent recall of the slave whip. Subtly, Yancey also intensifies her family's apparent distance, both literal and metaphorical, from the lighted town that lies in contrast, quote, white, unquote, off below this scene of reunion, a difference Yancey or her editor underlines with an explanatory annotation. This is an engineer's signal to his family when he comes in from a run, unquote. Appearing centrally in the collection, this poem details a railroad engineer's quiet return home from work on foot, whereupon he signals to his family his arrival by mimicking the cry of a night bird, and they call back in kind. And I'll end with her poem. White lies the town beneath, circled with lights like a wreath. Dirty and drab, he steps down from the cab. Whippoorwill, whippoorwill, whippoorwill. Hark, through the lone night still there's an answering note from the hill. Round the world's dome, now daddy's come home. Whippoorwill, whippoorwill, whippoorwill. With a courage that never fails, these hardy men of the rails in a humble way do their task each day. Whippoorwill, whippoorwill, whippoorwill. Thanks.
When Katherine first asked me to be a respondent, I thought, well, what I could do is get the book of poetry and just read some poems and share those with you. So I went to my favorite little site to get the book, and they only had one. It was a collector's edition. It was $450. So then I thought I better give a more proper response. There were two things about Katherine's talk about Bessie Woodson Yancey that struck me. And the first one was her global village mind. And then the second was the way she reframes the African American as well as the European American identity. So those are the two things I want to talk about. On the subject of the global village mind, I was struck by the fact that her subjects were so far-ranging that she talked about global issues as well as national and regional and local things, and that she critiqued the social development that crossed boundaries of gender as well as class. And so those things were particularly interesting, that she engaged people nationally in this discussion. The example of her take on the origin of the races and the overall effect that that has on world events would be a real case in point of that, and the cost that it was having even at that time in the Cold War. She composes across genres and talks not just, does not do just poetry, but also political talks and political opinions, and then she goes across cultures too, with her across the cultures of the standards of that time for women, and takes a much more strident role. Paula Gibson says in her book, When and Where I Enter, that black women have always been less constrained by the standards for femininity and are much more likely to speak out. And she certainly exemplified that. Although her main audience was the black community, she expanded that to include the white community so that the term racial community took on a wider American meaning. Her focus on youth as bearers of light to the future generations is pretty much reminiscent of our most recent election. Her writings were unpaid, free, yet she wrote prolifically, with conviction, and as Katherine said, almost weekly, a true avocation for her and something she must have felt totally compelled to do. Her focus on identity and its relationship to knowledge and of the past and the present is the other area that I wanted to comment on. Katherine spoke of her imagined youth reader. She had no hang-ups about the black children or black youth of that day. She had high expectations of them. She felt that they were capable as well as hungry to join the conversations about the racial community. And so she spoke directly to them many times in her poetry as well as in her letters and comments to the newspaper. She talked about the role of geography in racial identity and saw the South as having something to say and be heard by the United States. She felt that the South had as much of an intellectual African American base as did the northern and urban parts of the country. So she reframes the identity of the African American through those kinds of assumptions and expectations. She questions the European American identity when she talks about it being a world leader of democracy. She signifies on that a little bit when she talks about the lynchings and the role that Huntington could play if they would step up to the bat. Her specific remarks about her specific remarks in the tone of the biblical rhetoric and the common sense places her squarely, though, in the community of African American speakers. When I think of another West Virginian who, he's a preacher, T.D. Jakes, and when you hear him speak and you hear the biblical rhetoric, and yet he always brings it down with that common sense and how you should spend your money and how you should relate with the other, he plays those two together, and she was doing some of this same thing. I would call that almost a form of code switching. Another form of code switching would be her use of dialect in the poems in Echoes of the Hill. She talks about, in her stories and in her writings, she appeals to the African American reader specifically with her trickster themes, the bad man hero, as well as the regular heroes. And she understands the conflicted identity marker that dialect brings to a speaker who speaks out to a wider public. She knows that while dialect may be appreciated, it also is a marker that is a put down. And so in using that, she is working with both her African American community readers as well as her white American readers. But the dialect use also validated the lives of the African Americans. And so when I say that she's code switching in that way, she's using that as a form of validation. And as most African American writers who speak to the total American audience, there's always that need for a polydialectalism, I call it, to communicate across the generations and across cultures and across class perceived divisions. So in framing a more perfect American identity, it appears that Bessie Woodson Yancey contributed mightily to that effect. Thank you. Oh, I did have a couple of things I took notes on tonight. One was that you said that she signified in her poetry on West Virginia education, and I wanted to say that that would probably be true, being that her brother wrote The Miseducation of the Negro, so she probably had lots of things to signify on as far as the readers and things that students were reading at that time. And then the other thing is a little story about the high taxes and poor housing. Right now, we're in the midst of what they call urban renewal in the Black neighborhood, and it's on Artisan Avenue. And what's interesting about that is that a few years ago, a student here at Marshall did a sociological study of that area. And what she found out was that they took the plots of land there and they split them in half when African Americans began to move into that area, into that neighborhood. Split them in half and, of course, sold each half as if it were the whole. And so the higher taxes, in addition to paying for half of a whole, probably did bring, have some things. I mean, that was going on during that time, during the 30s and 40s, so I'm sure she had some comments to make about that. And then the other little story is the thing about Mississippi. Bilbo, Senator Bilbo. We were in North Carolina for a WAC conference a few years ago, and I went on the Geechee tour. And the young man who was leading the tour, he took us by this statue of John C. Calhoun. And he said, but the blacks here can never say his name right. They call him Kilhoun.
As the only Mississippian on the panel, I don't feel necessary to apologize. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to share in Professor Rodier's discussion of Bessie Woodson Yancey's letters. I hope to contribute a journalist's perspective about the letters. First, I will review the history of letters to the editor, then I'll return to Yancey. Letters to the editor have a long tradition that evolved alongside development of news sections at American newspapers. One historian argues, the history of the press is also, in a sense, the history of letters to the editor. From their earliest days, newspapers have relied on letters and other commentary from their readers to inform others and invite participation in the political process. Letters empower readers communicating with other readers, whether they are public relations people, politicians, or social political activists. Printers and postmasters usually managed and edited early newspapers. One of the earliest American newspapers was appropriately called the Boston Newsletter when it debuted in 1704. The name newsletter suggests a symbiotic relationship. One historian points out the letter-writing tradition of the colonial press could be seen as an example of a journalism of conversation. The notion that the primary role of the newspaper in society should be one of creating discussion about matters of common concern. It supported a principle of democratized national debate because it implied that the writer could be any member of the public. As they do today, letters also served as catalysts for political movements. Here are some examples of well-known letters. Newspapers published John Dickinson's Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer, about a dozen of them, that challenged British taxation and authority in 1767 and 1768. Dickinson correctly warned of conflict between Great Britain and the colonies. The Good Women of Kentucky complained in a 1787 letter to a newspaper that women's interests were not being addressed. In the many pieces which crowd our press, they wrote, not a single sentence is addressed to our sex. Letters also were essential to the women's movement during the 19th century. However, before the Civil War, women largely shunned newspaper publicity. The rare letters written by women and published in newspapers, such as Yancey's in The Advertiser, provide important windows into the past. One study about Women's Journal, a 19th century women's rights publication, argued the following about letter writers and activists. Letters to the editor reveal followers who signed the petitions, took them door to door, sang the songs, and walked in the parades, but were not usually heard by the larger national movement. Thus, with little known about these average suffragists, letters to the editor give insight into the thoughts, concerns, and activities of those who worked in local organizations as well as those who had no organization to join. Two of the most famous newspaper letters in journalism and American history involve slavery. Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, wrote and published an open letter to Abraham Lincoln called The Prayer of the 20 Millions on August 20th, 1862, urging the president to free the slaves. Lincoln's response also was printed as a letter in a newspaper, the National Intelligencer. Most of you may not have heard of the Intelligencer, but you've probably heard of this quotation. My paramount objective in this struggle is to save the Union and not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I will do it, right? Publication of the Greeley and Lincoln letters clearly involved some political grandstanding, but publication also served the public good by generating debate on an issue of public interest. Letters to the editor have been influential in foreign affairs as well. In response to opposition from Harvard professors in 1896, Theodore Roosevelt wrote a letter to the Harvard Crimson in support of the Monroe Doctrine involving a dispute between Venezuela and England. The New York Times considered Roosevelt's letter so important it even carried an article about the letter the day before the Crimson published it. One of the most celebrated letters of the 20th century is Martin Luther King's April 12, 1963 letter from a Birmingham jail. King's letter was first published in the magazine Christian Century and the Atlantic Monthly, among other publications. The letter rejected criticism from those who wanted to delay protest. Few mainstream news organizations employed black journalists during the period in which Yancey wrote her letters, 1946 through 1958. The New York Times hired its first black reporter the same year that Yancey began writing for The Advertiser. The Washington Post hired its first black journalist in 1952. I recall reading Simeon Booker's account of his experiences at the Post a couple of years ago. He said he had to use a separate restroom from Post reporters. Booker made a name for himself later for his coverage of the Emmett Till lynching case in the 1950s after leaving the Post. Yancey's achievements in this journalistic and racially segregated environment are all the more remarkable. Nothing in its history would have suggested tolerance as a trait to be found in the advertiser's DNA, or that it would nurture a relationship with a black woman over more than a decade. Its history suggested otherwise. Mainstream newspapers rarely printed letters from African Americans before the 1960s. Even today, letters from women and blacks are rarely published. However, the Advertiser seemed to go out of its way to accommodate Yancey, using her as it would a paid columnist. On occasion, it requested that she use a pseudonym, possibly in order to show an element of diversity in its pages. I have worked on staffs that would have considered so many letters from one person a nuisance. Most newspapers receive too many letters to allow one person to dominate their pages. Even C-SPAN limits access to callers. Before I close, I'd like to clarify something journalists know instinctively, but non-journalists do not necessarily know, that letters to the editor, editorials, and columns are different. Editorials are articles written by staff members employed to write opinions representing official positions taken by the newspaper. The editorial staff is separate from the news staff. The news people tend to hide their opinions from the public. Editorials appear on editorial pages without bylines and represent the official position of the opinion staff. Columns are opinion articles representing opinions of individual writers. The columns may be written by identified local writers or outsiders through syndication. Columnists do not speak for the publication or the editorial staff. Yancey's letters were neither columns nor editorials. From a journalistic perspective, they are the thoughts of an interested news consumer and should not be elevated to column or editorial status. For these reasons, even though many of the letters were well-written and informative, editors of the Advertiser would not have classified her letters as the work of journalists. However, it is clear the Advertiser exploited for its own reasons her eagerness to express political opinions and fill its editorial pages. More than 50 years later, it is impossible to determine why the Advertiser gave Yancey a prominent voice in its editorial pages. Today, it simply fuels much speculation and begs for additional research. I do not imply anything sinister. It could be that the newspaper was doing its job. Publishing readers' letters, then as now, allows newspapers to confirm their own worldview. On the other hand, publications of letters of opposing views suggest a quest for balance and a struggle for tolerance that few of us would have guessed was available in Huntington newspapers more than 50 years ago. Thank you.
Well, now I have to go last after all these fabulous people have spoken. But I also get to say how much this panel reminds me of the wonders of doing interdisciplinary work, and I'm seeing how people think in other disciplines. I love this Katherine's paper, and I thought Rodier just beautifully evoked Yancey's vision of the place of Huntington in the world, and there were complexities around that. And I thought it was it's such a striking difference from the image that we tend to have of Huntington today, or that it is easy to have of Huntington today. In Rodier's essay, Huntington emerges as very much part of this national and global community. So what I wanted to do today as an historian is just talk a little bit about that sort of issue of Yancey and national and global in the historical context. The first thing that struck me in relation to that was the ways that Yancey figures herself and Huntington's black community and part of this larger world. And she wasn't alone. Huntington, of course, in the 30s and 40s, and the period into which she's writing, really imagined itself exactly that way. And of course, though harmed by the Depression, Huntington had this long history of economic growth and importance going back to the 1870s that really located it through manufacturing, through trade, and part of a network of national and global world. And so part of what I thought was so fascinating in this study is the way that it suggests, or the way a figure like Yancey also puts Huntington in the center of the world, or this global network intellectually, politically, right, in other kinds of ways. And that is that she really spoke to a number of national themes in her work. And in some ways, I think in her person can be seen as a figure sort of both representing, right, those connections and also representing some kinds of national transitions that were going on. So I'm just going to speak to a couple of brief points. First is one way that I saw this is the way that Yancey really spoke explicitly to the global vision of the emerging civil rights movement. And here again, she's not alone in insisting that Huntingtonians, and especially African American Huntingtonians, were citizens of a global community, which again Rodier just evokes really beautifully. When Yancey compares American race relations to those in Nazi Germany, she's of course sort of echoing the language of the Double V campaign, right, that early civil rights campaign during World War II that sought to fix a fight against fascism abroad in connection with the fight against racism at home. So African Americans leaders asserted that the victory in the war should be a double victory, right, against fascism, against domestic racism, apartheid, American South. And then she also makes this comparison to the Soviet Union, pointing out the ways that Russia disallowed racism. Again, was really interesting. And this sort of moment in 1947, when the Cold War is just beginning to emerge, and of course in the context of the Cold War, making those kinds of unfavorable comparisons, right, of the racial politics in this country and in Russia was very embarrassing to the United States, and was one of the things that allowed the civil rights movement to get increasing support and attention nationally. It was, of course, also one of the reasons that civil rights activists risked being labeled as communists because of that association. So interestingly, the next year in 1948, with the year when the Cold War really sort of snaps into focus, Yancey very clearly positions herself, right, as a patriotic supporter of the Cold War by referencing Russia, or speaking of Russia as a sort of global menace, right, the kind of Cold War threat. So it's just interesting in the way she's sort of picking up those kind of or echoing and enriching those national civil rights discussions that are really thinking of these issues globally. Another issue that I thought was really interesting in that regard was the way that she spoke to youth, right? The comments also sort of thought express the kind of importance of that youth audience and the significance of that youth audience. One of the things that I thought about it, that initially it just seemed to me such an obviously gendered choice, right? That women, particularly in that time period, had a kind of legitimacy in speaking to educational issues and to young people that would have been more questionable elsewhere. And I wondered about the ways that lent weight and legitimacy to some of her political claims. But I also wondered about how it reflects a kind of recognition of the importance of young people in emerging grassroots civil rights activism. So just thinking about the 1940s in particular as this decade when there was beginnings of sort of shifts in racial politics. And on the national front, the ways that in the 40s the FBI is finally sort of prosecuting racially motivated killings and going after lynchings. Then the 40s also begin to get a sense of the importance of the African American vote in the North, and in the South, a kind of breakdown of the cotton economy that means controlling the black labor force doesn't have the same immediate imperative. And in that decade as well, there's a new generation of African American youth who are unwilling to accede to the kind of racial status quo. And several historians have sort of talked about this, a kind of musical interest of young people that are shifting to very sort of race-conscious music, adopting clothing styles and self-presentation that really expressed, right, pride and resistance. And seemingly spontaneous everyday resistance, right? The sort of stories of young people in the South resisting segregated streetcars and buses, young people going to movie theaters that are white only and buying tickets and knowing they're going to be denied entrance, but sort of going back night after night nonetheless. Right, sort of seemingly spontaneous, a really very grassroots level shift that was supported by sort of an older generation of African American leaders. But nonetheless, it really sort of evokes or suggests a shift in consciousness among young people starting in the 1940s. And so I wondered about that and that sort of connection and the way that she's really speaking to young people, a kind of recognition maybe of something transformative happening in that moment. And then the last thing really quickly is just thinking about her position as an African American woman activist. And reading the stuff from Yancey, she just, how she thinks and speaks politically is just so reminiscent of the role of African American women going back to the late 19th century in the Black Women's Club movement, in progressive era social activism going into the 20s and the 30s as African American women were able to be both leaders, both in terms of sort of community development, right, racial uplift in the language of the day, also increasingly sort of politically challenging racial politics, right, being sort of a larger political voice. And she's also a brilliant woman, very educated, definitely part of the intelligentsia, right, a middle-class person, and in those ways seems to really embody, right, this long tradition of African-American women activists, and at the same time sort of speaking to this kind of emerging generation of sort of rebellious, right, younger people and that kind of shift into more radical civil rights activism in the time period. So again, I just think that's sort of really interesting that her figure, right, that she both kind of represents and is speaking to these larger discourses of civil rights activism and ideas, and also this kind of transition, right, a moment in the kinds of, in national activism. And again, in those ways, really locates herself in Huntington and Huntington itself, right, as part of this national and global community. Anyway, and again, thank you. I thought it was a wonderful paper. And I'm done. See, I have to go last, so I feel like I should say something fun.